I'd like to now introduce our third speaker for today's panel, Aaron Detlor. Aaron Detlor is a Ganikahawa Mohawk lawyer from Kente, Haudenosaunee, who works extensively with Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council. Aaron was one of the architects in the Haudenosaunee Development Institute, which was established to reaffirm Haudenosaunee rights on Turtle Island. So please help me welcome Aaron Detlor.
Thanks very much, Eva, and thanks everyone who participated in the organization. Eva's been great in actually calling me last night at 11 o'clock to make sure that we were on track for today. I appreciate everyone being here today. My Indian name is Garliwa Yandarli Yazayats, and I want to get that in because I don't think we can speak English completely after Wes's introduction. And so in the language I would say Watahonsiyos Gunjonkwa, which means all you people, you're ready to listen and open up your ears. And the way that we try and speak is much the way that Eva previously described it. We try not to use harsh words, and we're supposed to have a good mind when we deliver these things. I'm here on behalf of the Chiefs, so that's what I just want to make that quite clear. One of the important functions, though, of understanding who the Haudenosaunee are is probably who they are not and what they are not. And we stand in a little bit of contrast to some of our other Indigenous partners. We're not Canadians. I can't stress that enough. We've never been Canadians, and we never will be Canadians. And that's not to say that we don't love and respect Canadians. It's just that there's never been a choice actually put to the Haudenosaunee, do you want to be Canadians? If that choice was put to them, they would likely say no. There's been sort of this assumed colonizing aspect of citizenship in trying to subordinate Haudenosaunee principles and Haudenosaunee governance structures. The second part I just want to identify quickly for Haudenosaunee purposes is that today we are on Haudenosaunee treaty territory. And this goes beyond what you've seen in the Line 9 stuff. The Line 9 is going to pass on 6 miles of the Grand River, and that is something that's referred to often as the Haldimand Proclamation or the Haldimand Deed. The Haldimand Proclamation and the Haldimand Deed actually sits on top of a much older treaty, what's sometimes referred to as the Nanfan Treaty of 1701. We don't like to necessarily refer to it as the Nanfan because that's the British participant, actually it was German, who negotiated that treaty on behalf of the Crown at the time. But the Nanfan Treaty runs from somewhere in Ohio, if you're going to move from west to east. It starts somewhere in Ohio, and it ends up somewhere very close to Oshawa. The Nanfan Treaty goes down to the Carolinas, and it goes up to close to Sudbury. And it's often described as something being 800 miles by 400 miles. The important part for the purposes of this of Enbridge's activity and their failure to recognize that treaty deal with the actual content and language and the context in which that treaty was entered into. The treaty provides to the Haudenosaunee free and undisturbed harvesting over that particular area. Free and undisturbed. Now, if I talk to somebody and say, I ask you, what does undisturbed mean? It means if something is disturbing me as a Haudenosaunee person, you are not permitted to do it. So that's the end of it. That should be the end of the discussion. We've had a significant amount of trouble from the province of Ontario, from municipalities, and from Canada, who all have a vested interest in seeing this development proceed. It's not necessarily the governments that we keep having the problems with, it's the financial interests that support the governments, that put the governments there, and it actually gets more, I was at a meeting yesterday with a developer who wants to build a bunch of houses, and he came to us, the Haudenosaunee Development Institute. He said, we have this process where they have to submit an application, they have to give us $7,000, we have an architect, we have an archaeologist, we have an environmental. And he said, you know, this is the best $7,000 I spent. When I went to talk to the municipality, I was told that I had to put a certain amount of money in the director, in the head of planning and engineering. I had to put a certain amount of money in his wife's bank account. What? And everybody went, oh, but you know, if you've come from Quebec or you've been watching, this stuff is going on all the time. This is the process under which they're used to working. So what the HDI did is, as a function of Haudenosaunee jurisdiction, we take it quite seriously in terms of where that jurisdiction comes from. We had a brief discussion earlier from Wes about how treaties exist and stand, I don't want to say necessarily supersede Canadian jurisprudence or Canadian legislation, but yeah, I agree with that. But we don't necessarily, as Haudenosaunee people, exist, and we don't necessarily exert our jurisdiction on Turtle Island in this particular area because of the treaties we entered into with settlers and colonizers. And I apologize for using that term, but if you're not Ongwe and you're not Haudenosaunee, you're a settler or a colonizer. And I think without saying that in an aggressive way, without making it accusatory, it's just trying to understand who we are. So we don't necessarily believe when we start talking about these things that when we're talking about jurisdiction, we're talking about environmental impacts, that we need to define ourselves or define the manners in which we articulate our jurisdiction in relation to our agreements with settlers. So I asked Wes earlier if we've gone through the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee is the opening, and Wes said there was an opening done this morning. All that we've done in the HDI is we've reaffirmed and set down in some policies. We actually have a significant amount of policy work, development work on what types of developments we'd like to see, how we'd like developments to proceed, how developments are supposed to interface with what we call Yonkinistan or Hunja or Yetinistan or Hunja, our mother of the earth, and how we can build these sustainable communities. And quite frankly, we don't see at this point that the movement of tar sand oil from Alberta through Ontario helps. No one has presented to me a positive, anything, and we tried to keep an open mind about this, to look at it, and Enbridge's approach to date has simply been, well, we don't really need to talk to you. We're going to comply with this environmental regime we've strictly avoided getting into. We've avoided, to some extent, going down the EA process, going through the court process, because that's not a satisfactory process for us as, I'm going to say sovereign, we don't like that word either, but us as a sovereign people. We have our own process, we have our own laws, and they're equally valid and legitimate. We've come to this sort of point now with developers and with Enbridge where the next step for us is what we call a cease and desist order. We actually go back and we take their applications and we review the projects, we send them out to our experts, our Haudenosaunee experts, and we then have a cease and desist order from the chiefs. And we've sent that out to a number of developments who failed to comply. I see some familiar faces here who actually helped with some of that cease and desist order. And that's simply because the policies don't comply with the Haudenosaunee principles. We have the Mother Earth, Yonkinistan, Hunja. We have all the people here. We actually take very seriously our responsibility to not just the Haudenosaunee, but to all people in Turtle Island. And that's when we do the opening, the very first thing we do is we give thanks to all the people, not just the Haudenosaunee people, or not just the Ongwe people, but we give that kind of thanks. We're at a bit of a crossroads now as an institution because the chiefs take very seriously their role as chiefs, and the chiefs take on a function of maintaining the ceremonies, maintaining the language. They have a governance structure. Our chiefs are not the people who go out in the land to stop things. That's sort of the responsibility of the Haskaligeta, people like other people like me. We're now here because today we understand we need to come up with some strategic means for developing a relationship and developing a relationship amongst the different groups that are here today, the different people. And then actually, instead of just talking about what we're going to do, actually coming up with something concrete. I would really look forward today to say, we came away from this day with something concrete. Because if we give a cease and desist order, and we have 100 people there, it was interesting, the OPP showed up, and I think, Spur, you were there that day when the OPP showed up. They walked up and they said, what's going on? We said, here's our cease and desist order. They looked at us and said, okay, we'll be standing over at the side of the road. Tell us when you get this settled. The police aren't taking the kind of steps against us because they realize that the underlying title, the underlying treaty right is something that they can't simply swoop in on and start arresting people. And this is in part one of the only successes to the tragic death of Mr. George of the Ipperwashing Party. The OPP have some kind of cognizance of this treaty right thing, and they're not there to police it in the sense where they're going to advance the government's position. So that's what we'd like to get out of this today. The struggle, though, as we look for solutions, at least from my perspective and the perspective of the chiefs, is that we do exist in a treaty relationship with the people here, and that treaty relationship is founded on the two-row. And as much as we understand and appreciate and need partnerships and friends, I'm going to say friends instead of partnerships for now, I think. We need more friends. We also have to respect that that two-row means two rows. We have our own way. We have our own way of doing things. We're more than happy to help, but we don't want to see our way get recolonized by another process, even if that process has the same ends as we're seeking. So, とにかくお願いします。